Okay. Oh, I forgot to do my earphones. I'm going to attempt to switch over to this microphone real quick. It's just a little bit easier, I think. I feel like I focus more. Maybe that's artificial. Microphone for the computer's better, but it did switch over. So if anybody has any comments on that, let me know. Welcome to another edition of JVB Live, part of my personal improvement project during the stay-at-home order here in Hawaii to try to improve my skill at live streaming and discussing things that I think are pertinent to today's world in the midst of COVID-19, and just some other general comments and observations about life based on my experience. And I want to start off with some updates on personal improvement. So hopefully, if you have stay-at-home orders, if you're in one of the many, many states that has stay-at-home orders or across the world, you are taking on personal projects that you can improve and improve your skills in something, whether that's learning a coding language, whether that's reading some great books to improve your knowledge of things, whether that's improving your health, your exercise regimen. Me personally, the two big ones, aside from health and nutrition, which are I'm really trying to be disciplined in. The two big ones besides that were waking up early and doing simulated day trading and swing trading in the stock market. And number two, doing these live streams. So those are the two skills I'm trying to develop. And hopefully each day is improving. And if anybody is familiar with incremental improvements or compounding interest concepts, basically one of the philosophies that has arrived at over time with some of the roles I've been in is this concept of incremental improvement, this 1% daily improvement. And you'll find this in a lot of different sources. Atomic Habits is a book by James Clear that covered this. I learned about the concept before that from another book called Raving Fans, which is a much earlier, older book, I think written in the 90s, about effective customer service. And in there, it talked about a 1% improvement. So what is this concept? It's every day you are trying to improve by 1% in whatever it is. And the idea of that is if you do that each and every single day, then over time, that effort compounds and turns exponential. So I did the math, and basically if you really take this to heart and you try to improve 1% every single day, then after 1 year of effort, you will be 37 times better than when you began. So imagine being 37 times better at anything. Imagine being 37 times better at your nutrition, 37 times better at your exercise regimen, 37 times better at a particular skill set, maybe coding or writing or this live casting or studying a topic, studying something that interests you, or 37 times better at interacting and relating to your family or your friends. So it's a very powerful concept, and my goal is to get 1% better in each of those domains every day as best I can. Now, confession, today wasn't one of those days. I was up late doing a live stream last night, and therefore I slept in until about 4:30 or 5 Hawaii time, AM. So I missed the stock market open and the potential to make some pretty good fake money because I'm doing paper trading. And when I woke up and saw the swings in the price of one of the stocks I had, I was like, ah, and then it dropped, of course, below the price point that I paid for it. And so I'm holding on to it to see what happens. And of course, this gets into the whole toughness that people have with loss aversion. So it's about twice as hard for us to lose something as it is for us to gain something. But alas, I digress. So not very good with that. And then the other thing, so far, my nutrition has kind of gone out the window, at least the last 12 hours. I've been pretty disciplined. I can stay disciplined up through about midday in terms of protein, keeping track of my macros. And then at night when my kids go to bed and I get some time to do some reading and some research and maybe work on a live stream, that's when my diet starts to go out the window. I'll snack and eat Hershey's Kisses and all kinds of stuff that's not great. So hey, the idea is that each day you wake up with the intent of improving incrementally in that one area, and hopefully over time, if you have a day where you do snack out and pig out, or maybe a couple days where you don't exercise, The next day, start from zero and with the intent of improving 1% from where you currently are. A lot of us get that guilt and shame wrapped up into our psyche. We may be aware of it, we may not be, but that guilt and shame, I've already lost 2 days, I messed up yesterday, so what's the use? We tend to be very hard on ourselves in terms of getting back on track with this incremental improvement program, regardless of what the discipline or the topic is. So that's full confession. I've been slacking a little bit in those areas in the last day, really. Okay, so let's get up to speed on COVID-19 updates and cases. Oh, by the way, personal improvement plan. Let me know if you watch this. Send me a message, DM me on Twitter, and let me know what it is you're working on. My brother, I think, is working on art. My other brother is working on singing and some other things. My mom's working on some things. So, we're working on some things with our children. So this is a great time to do it and to become better people, improve in areas that we find are weak areas in our life. If you have the capacity to do that. Now, if you're in survival mode, it's a lot harder to apply this principle if you're in survival mode. And having been in survival mode myself at various times in my life, I fully understand what that looks like. So, okay, COVID-19, where are we at? As of a few minutes ago, we are at 579,390 positive tests in the US and 23,529 deaths. So what does that give us? That gives us a death rate based on the number of positive cases. And I've talked a lot about the numerator and denominator challenges of this equation over the last several days. So we're at a 4% death rate right now with those numbers. But just to review, the numerator is fuzzy, the denominator is definitely fuzzy, and we're getting more information on a routine basis to suggest why the denominator is fuzzy, and that is the total number of cases of COVID-19. And I want to talk about a few of those in a moment, but first, I've been pretty critical of the models. Not critical, skeptical, I would say. And I've been skeptical of models for quite a while. I've seen modeling in academic settings, I've seen them in business settings, and they're helpful. One of my favorite quotes out of the last 2 weeks is that all models are wrong, some are useful, or some are helpful. And I might be paraphrasing it, but that's by a famous statistician, and I tweeted that out earlier this morning. So there's a University of Sydney article that came out that basically, I'll just read you the title, US COVID-19 deaths poorly predicted by IHME model. The IHME model is this one that I've been referencing for the last 2 weeks, which is this University of Washington model where you have real-time information getting fed back into the model, and they've adjusted their predictions down and up. I think the latest prediction actually went up from about 61,000 to 70,000 or somewhere thereabouts. So this University of Sydney article really calls into question some of the findings of this preeminent model that at least the US policymakers are using. So I'll just read a little bit from it. An international group of data scientists led by the University of Sydney's Center for Translational Data Science has found that over 70% of US states had death rates that were inconsistent with IHME predictions. An international group of renowned statisticians from Sydney, Northwestern University, and University of Texas have collaborated to fully investigate the predictive performance of COVID-19 model developed at the University of Washington, which provides forecasts for ventilator use and hospital beds in the United States. Published on pre-publication server, the researchers found that the IHME model substantially underestimates the uncertainty associated with COVID-19 deaths. 70% of US states had an actual death rate outside the 95% prediction interval for that state, casting doubt on whether the model is suitable to inform COVID-19 resource allocation. The model, which provides forecasts on a state-by-state basis across the US, has been circulated widely by the media and on social media and has informed policy decisions at the highest levels, having been cited at the White House several times. The discrepancy, and this is a quote from the article, quote, the discrepancy between predicted deaths and the actual death rate in the US has serious implications for the United States government's future planning and provisions of ventilators, PPE, and the staffing of medical professionals equipped to respond to this pandemic, said University of Sydney statistician and director of the Center for Translational Data Science, Professor Sally Cripps. The level of uncertainty implied by the model cast doubt on its usefulness to drive the development of health, social, and economic policy, she said. And then Professor Martin Tanner from Northwestern University also said the model did not have the capacity to make long-term projections. And his quote is, "I'm concerned that if the IWIHME model has had difficulty in predicting the next day, how will the predictions fare over the long term?" Okay, so I want to talk about understanding prediction levels, prediction intervals. If you haven't had statistics or any background on statistics, reading confidence intervals, this may be somewhat of a foreign language to you, but those who have had statistical training, this will be somewhat familiar, or at least sound familiar. So I want to read you this so you can kind of understand what's happening. In making a prediction, often called a point estimate about the rate of spread and death rate of a new virus in New York, it is widely understood that the prediction carries uncertainty, said Professor Cripps. Statisticians give a range called a prediction interval in which the actual future values are likely to lie. This involves estimating uncertainty. A 95% prediction interval is an interval where we would expect 95% of the actual future values to lie, she said. So this is a bell curve. You know, we're all familiar with the bell curve. Flatten the curve is the public health call to action for the US. So the bell curve at the very tail ends will have these 5% ranges. And so the idea of these models is to estimate the likelihood that the future value is going to fall inside of that 95%. So cutting off the tails and then inside of that bell curve where you cut off the 5% at the bottom, and that 5% is uncertainty. So that's what she's talking about. IHME's model gives 95% prediction intervals for the number of deaths in each state. If the uncertainty is estimated correctly, then we would expect that 95% of states to have actual values lie in those intervals, she said. But we don't. In fact, only 30% of US states have actual death counts which lie within the 95% prediction intervals, while 70% lie outside that interval. So what she's saying is that for each state, there's 50 different bell curves, and only 30% of US states have a value of deaths that is within that 95% value on that bell curve as predicted by this model, which means 70% of the states, the overwhelming majority, are contained in those tails, and typically on the tail that is the fewer number of deaths. So it's that 5% on the tail of that bell curve. That's what she's saying. So this calls into question a lot of the modeling, and I've been on a kind of a kick the last couple of days about modeling and how models are used in policy making and in persuasion and in advocating for something, but really, are they accurate and are they authoritative in the sense that we may think that they are? And I think that these critiques call into question the modeling that we're given, and certainly Europe is dealing with their own models in the UK and calling into question some of those assumptions. So I think the outcome of this, which will be good, is there's going to be a much more healthy skepticism in the general public about models. And I would submit that healthy skepticism is going to make us better in the future as opposed to worse. So wanted to cover that. I will share my view about models. I think that we have reason to believe all models to have some sort of error and uncertainty, and going in and looking at those models with that understanding is going to just help us have adult conversations about models and what they mean to us. Okay, so another thing that came out, I talked yesterday about this article out of the Spectator magazine, which was this antibody study done in Germany that shows 15% infection rate. And so this was a random sample of 1,000 people in Germany. And the result was, what they found is a 15% infection rate, which means there's a lot of people who are asymptomatic. And that goes to that denominator challenge of getting that denominator correct. Well, there's new information that came out today, and this was tweeted by Scott Gottlieb, who's a guy on Twitter. You should follow him, Scott Gottlieb, MD. So he tweeted about this study of pregnant women in New York, and this was done in the New England Journal of Medicine. So in New York City, there were 215 pregnant women that delivered infants in one of the hospitals. All of them were screened for COVID-19 because they don't want to have the baby come out with COVID. And what they found was that 29, 29 were positive for COVID, and only 4 had symptoms at the time of the testing. So the majority were asymptomatic. And of the majority that were asymptomatic, only a handful went on after this test to develop symptoms, which means the overwhelming majority of the non-symptomatic positive testees never had symptoms, or very, very mild symptoms, nothing that would arise to the level of, going to a hospital or even seeing a doctor. So this suggests that there was a infection rate or an exposure rate of 13.7%. And the article yesterday from the Spectator, I'm sorry, suggests that if we get to a 15% infection rate, then this thing is way more prevalent than we think. And what that means is that the mortality rates that we're using are grossly overstating the mortality rate. And so some of the mortality rates I saw in yesterday's article that I covered are mortality rates down in the, let's see, 0.37%, 0.9%, 0.66%. So these are all estimates under 1%, which is fantastic. Now, I live in Hawaii, and we have about a 1.3% mortality rate. And you compare that to New York State. New York State is up in the 4, 5, 6%, somewhere in the 4 to 5 general percent in terms of mortality rate. So if, in fact, 15% of the population is exposed, then I would think that those numbers would go down. And perhaps the artificiality of Hawaii, maybe it's not an artificiality, but perhaps the reason Hawaii has lower mortality rates and places like California and Oregon and Washington is because the amount of testing that's being done covers more of the infected population. So you have just a little bit better denominator number in that equation. So this is the second piece of news in 2 days about asymptomatic exposure antibodies and antibody testing in Germany. This was direct COVID testing in New York City, but hopefully more information is going to trickle in about these antibody tests. I'm sure we're going to hear more about this as the week goes on. And my prediction is the death rate is going to go down. The mortality rate is going to drop with each finding. So I wouldn't be surprised if the mortality rate goes below 1% by the end of this week. Now, I could be wrong, but that's my prediction. So that's good news, if true. That's very, very good news. And I really like it. So a lot of these things I get tipped off by media that I consume and media that I listen to. So I want to give credit to Ben Shapiro's podcast. I get some of the stuff from him, not all of it. Most of the pre-work that I do is my own, but I do get ideas and exposed to things that I otherwise wouldn't come across by listening to him or reading tweets like him or others. And there's a whole bunch of other people I follow on Twitter. Mark Snyder for the Green New Deal, various other people, Mike Cernovich, which was calling for the New York Times to investigate Tara Reade's allegations against Joe Biden. So all these people, these pushers of truth in Twitter, and I get engaged, tied down in these debates all the time with college buddies and random people on Twitter. But I wanted to kind of talk about cross-discipline hubris and tie it into what I've experienced in my 20 years in government and the private sector. So grad school. So in grad school, I did my master's thesis, which blended, it was cross-disciplinary. So I used concepts from game theory, I used concepts from behavioral economics, and I attempted to combine those two things into a model, or it wasn't really a model of sorts, but it was more of a structure, an education structure for staffers in Congress to think a little bit differently about the deficit and the national debt. That was my project. And what I found when I was doing that project, so I was always a generalist. I was interested in multidisciplines and how they all relate together. And that's how I've been my whole life, going back into high school. And what I really loved is you're in one discipline and then you get exposed to another discipline, and a concept that you learn, a lesson that you learned in this discipline directly applies to this other discipline, and few people see it, and it gives you a deeper, enriched understanding of that new discipline. And what I found when I was in grad school was that there is a um, hesitation in my professors who were giving me guidance. There's a hesitation to speak outside of their expertise. So let's say you were a PhD in economics, and I was asking for some commenting on, let's say, behavioral economics or game theory. There's definitely a hesitation to comment into a realm of knowledge that they weren't an expert in. They would rather stay in their lane, and I thought that was very interesting. It wasn't a negative thing, except that it was that bridging I had to do kind of on my own or with other cross-disciplinary people like business people, business professors. So all that to say that you'll see this in the debate about the modeling and about uh, you know medicine, public health versus economists and opening up the economy again. So these people with different backgrounds, different disciplines, and you heard this in Dr. Fauci's statements last night or yesterday in the presser, that he feels comfortable only commenting on the public health nature of the crisis and what he would do. He can't comment outside of that realm of knowledge. And I commend him for that because in his role, that's where he should be commenting. But there's a piece today in the Times of Israel and in another Israel publication, the Jewish Journal. And I found this on Real Clear Politics, which is a great site. And it talks about an Israeli leader. He's a mathematician, so that's important. He's a mathematician, and he basically did this analysis of the death rates and came to the conclusion. I'll just read a little bit from the article. The title is Top Israeli Prof Claims Simple Stats Show Virus Plays Itself Out After 70 Days. So this is his claim. And notice some of the wording in this article. So the subtitle, Isaac Ben Israel, who is not a medical expert, says analysis worldwide shows new cases peaking after about 40 days, slams economic closures, leading doctor dismisses his claims. A prominent Israeli mathematician, analyst, and former general claims simple statistical analysis demonstrates that the spread of COVID-19 peaks after about 40 days and declines to almost zero after 70 days, no matter where it strikes and no matter what measures governments impose to try to thwart it. Professor Isaac Ben Israel, head of the Security Studies program at Tel Aviv University and the chairman of the National Council for Research and Development, told Israel's Channel 12 Monday night that research he conducted with a fellow professor analyzing the growth and decline of new cases in countries around the world showed repeatedly that there is a set pattern and the numbers speak for themselves. While he said he supports social distancing, the widespread shuttering of economies worldwide constitutes a demonstrable error in light of those statistics. In Israel's case, he notes, about 140 people normally die every day. To have suffered much of the economy because of a virus that is killing one or two a day is a radical error that is unnecessarily costing Israel 20% of its GDP, he charged. Okay, so mathematician has this, he looks at the numbers. Mathematician, safe to assume they have knowledge in statistics and pretty sophisticated knowledge in statistics, but he's not a doctor, right? So Professor Gabby Barbish comes, hospital director and the former health ministry director general, insisted in a bitter TV exchange that Ben Israel is mistaken and that the death tolls would have been far higher if Israel and other countries had not taken the steps they did. But Ben Israel said the figures, notably from countries such as Singapore, Taiwan, Sweden, which did not take such radical measures to shutter their economies, proved his point. And then he posted some graphs, which are in Hebrew, which I can't read. When Barbish, the critic, cited New York as ostensible proof that Ben Israel was mistaken, Ben Israel noted the latest indications from New York were precisely in line with his statistics that indicate daily new cases figures peaking and starting to fall after about 40 days. Asked to explain the phenomenon, Ben Israel, who also heads Israel's space agency, later said, I have no explanation. There are all kinds of speculations. Maybe it's related to climate or the virus has a lifespan of its own. Just speculating at that point. Okay, so what I love is that people outside the medical discipline pointing out statistical information, errors in modeling, and they're one key line of attack, which you'll see over and over and over, is they're not a doctor. They're not a doctor. So I want to tell you a story about grad school. My econometrics professor, he was a professor of economics. And yet his professional research and what he would mostly do is he would write articles in medical journals ripping apart the methodology of medical studies. So he was entering into a different discipline as an economist to attack the methodology of the medical profession. And he was very good at it and enjoyed it, you could tell. So when I was going through this class, I found it fascinating because there's usually a blind spot when you have expertise in an area that somebody looking from the outside surely can't have new information that you may be wanting to know about your methodology. There's almost a hubris that develops, and you reject outside information and sometimes just frankly dismiss it out of hand without critically examining it because it's somebody not in your discipline. And this almost looks like a case like that for me. And also that article from the previous articles I just cited, the University of Sydney, those weren't medical doctors. They were statisticians. And some other critics of modeling have been outside the disciplines of the models they're critiquing. So you'll see, I think one theory I have is the reason these critics don't gain more traction is because they are outside the discipline. And argument of authority is pretty persuasive. So if you have an expert in an area who seems to have a handle on the information, then just consciously we're more likely to favor that expert, even in the midst of information from an outside look that calls that expert into question, or that expertise, or that discipline. It can cross disciplines and not be towards any one person. So this ties back into this whole realms of knowledge thing that Scott Adams talks about quite a bit. Scott Adams from the Dilbert cartoon, at Scott Adams Says. He's got a daily podcast, which is pretty good. And he makes a case that we all have access to realms of knowledge, and it's usually based on our experience, our academic training. And you're more likely to have an uninformed critique if you don't have experience in certain realms of knowledge. And so this almost cuts the opposite way of what I was just talking about, an outside look by, let's say, a mathematician into a medical model. But but the whole general idea is that if you have a narrow focus, let's say you have a limited realm of knowledge. Let's say you went to high school, you went to college, you studied English, you went to law school, you practiced law, and that's what you did. And you've lived in two places in your life. Well, you're naturally going to be informed by the place you were, the education you had, the culture that you grew up in or work in, and outside information from people who have other realms of knowledge, say about other disciplines like economics or small business or other areas, entertainment, whatever the case may be. If they start to run up against your prior assumptions, your prior beliefs, you're going to resist that. And you'll see that all the time. So I've been getting into arguments in Twitter about this precise thing. Critics of the administration, aside from the politics thing, because it seems like this is, the politics and the emotional have crossed, and people really are judging people they've never met based on the information they're seeing. And so I'm trying to share that there's other charitable explanations, and you would see those explanations if you had perhaps experience in other realms. And as justification for that view, I talk a lot about some of my background. So just to cover it a little bit, I have 20 years experience in government and in the private sector and in academia. So 20 years experience. I have personally lived in 1/6 of the US states. So I've lived personally in 8 states. I have experienced, in living in those 8 states, I would submit all of the major subcultures of the US country. So I've lived in the Northeast. I've experienced the New England culture. I've lived in outside of Washington, D.C. I've experienced that culture. I've lived in the South in Florida. I've experienced the Southern culture. I've lived in the Midwest, Indiana and Oklahoma. My wife's from South Dakota, so I've experienced that Midwestern culture. And I've spent most of my time in California and Hawaii. So I've experienced the West Coast culture and of course the Hawaiian culture, which is lovely. So all that to say, there's been a broad exposure to all these different cultures, and those were in business, those were in government working, so in the military, living in all those different areas. And the military has its own insulary bubble thinking for sure, but you're exposed to the culture at large, and in small business and academia. So, uh, and in discipline, I've been in a whole bunch of different disciplines. So I was educated as an engineer, and I joined the military, became a pilot, so aviator, and then went to grad school and got a public policy degree. Also, in between being a pilot and going to grad school, I was in the entertainment space for a while, a starving actor and musician and composer and writer. So I've experienced that in Los Angeles. And most recently, I've been in small business for the last 7 years. So I've experienced the very real challenges of managing and growing and running a company in a significant leadership role for small business. So all that to say that I bring all that background to my opinions about politics and my opinions about this type of thing, and most of the personal conflict that I see, regardless of the organization, regardless of whether it's public sector, private sector, public politics, most of the conflict I see are people taking a few data points and stringing a narrative between those data points, oftentimes in error, and leading to a conclusion about a particular person or a particular topic or a particular organization that 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 is a caricature of the real thing, and is not entirely representative of what's going on. And there's difficulty when you do that of breaking out of that process and considering other data points or alternative narratives that may be pertinent to your opinion. So I see that all the time. And of course, when you're a big hammer, everything looks like a nail. Okay, critique known. But I see this all the time, and I feel like it's one of my roles to point it out to people and challenge them on it. So, like for example, on Twitter today, I was having this big back and forth last night with my buddy Justin, who is a guy who disagrees with me on pretty much everything. And we had a podcast 12 years ago, dialoguing and debating these kinds of things. So this person who was, I don't know, who was, I guess, observing this dialogue, jumped in and said, what is okay? So we were talking about we're talking about charity, and we were talking about reports. I gotta go down pretty far. Where is this? Okay, so what were we talking about? Oh, we were talking about, okay, the press basically attacking Trump yesterday and trying to point out, inactivity in February. And I was trying to point out that in any organization, you have data and information overload, and sometimes it's very easy to get swamped in information, and it takes very effective management and prioritization to sift through all the information, figure out what's important and what's not, and everything's important. So, and you only have limited time, you only have limited resources in terms of personnel, so you're going to make do with what you got. And I was offering an explanation. I don't know if this is true. This is just my imagining because I've been in government and I've been in small business and I've experienced this myself on multiple occasions. You have a lot of priorities, a lot of information. You can't act on everything. So you have this system where information's coming in, you at least hear it, and then you have to prioritize it, make decisions. And I was suggesting that the situation in February looked like this. We just come out of impeachment, January impeachment. The vote happened in early February. Trump closed China at the end of January. And then he's attempting to re-engage with, I don't know this for sure, but my imagining was, okay, if I run a big organization, I got to move forward with my agenda. So he's got, so that the machine turns on or shifts from being distracted from this impeachment thing, which probably took a lot of time, and then starts to try to execute their plan. And you have a lot of information, a lot of things happening. None of that's getting covered. Not a lot of understanding about how um, an executive team or a cabinet might process and filter and present that information. And so I was trying to present this as, okay, fog of war. Uh, yes, there are people sounding the alarm early, but there's a lot of uncertainty. And then I had this person pipe in, and here's what this person says. You have low expectations, Joel. Aren't you even slightly discomforted by the president's leadership? And I replied, I actually have high expectations, as my direct reports will tell you, and my subordinate leaders. I think POTUS leadership is tough for many. Would I have liked to have him? Would I have liked to be in a squadron with him as a commander? I don't know. But I do think many readings are misreadings of his skills. And then the response was, thing is, it's tragic to watch. My heart goes out to Americans who don't deserve this grotesque parody of leadership. And then my buddy chimes in, I think what Bell is getting at here is that you may have high expectations of your subordinates, but you seem to have very low expectations of a leader, at least of one that share most of your political priorities. And I respond, I think the biggest objectionable part of Trump's leadership from critics, as far as I can tell, is his style, not his actual leadership. If his leadership is effective, to me, style is secondary. To me, his style is abrasive to critics, in part because he fights with the press constantly, and that's really it. Um, so I got criticized for that. If you're trying to vocally understand his critics, you'll need to try harder than that, barely scratching the surface. And then this person who responds, reading Joel's response, I'm now doubting his good faith. Okay, so maybe, doubting my good faith. It's not as if all of Trump's many and substantial failings of policy and governance haven't been carefully recorded. It's impossible to believe that his critics are simply disturbed by his style. Disappointing, to be honest. And then I issued a challenge. We'll see if it's taken up, and if it is, I'll talk about it. And I said, okay, give me your single biggest failure as evidence of his poor leadership. And I suggested if you are open to considering other explanations for this example, we may get somewhere. Otherwise, it's simply polemic. So I'm trying to challenge people to think outside of their narrow scope. And certainly this cuts all ways. I'm sure it cuts against me as well. I'll acknowledge that for sure. It's universal. But based on the experience I just listed, I feel like I do have a little bit to offer to the conversation that other people may not have experienced and circumstances they may not have been in. So I leave you with that. This back and forth between experts in the medical field and experts outside of the medical field critiquing models is simply fascinating to me because you'll see this literally all the time. And my personal view is that there should be more cross-discipline dialogue because you can't help but pick up good techniques and good insights by working cross-discipline, in my view. Okay, so in other news, there's been some intercepted State Department cables from back in 2018 that indicate concern about China studying a bat coronavirus in a lab. So these intercepted cables, which again are 2 years old, lend credibility to where the origin of this virus came from, possibly a lab in Wuhan. We don't know, but I thought that was interesting. So this is something, I guess, that's been out there for quite a while. And the article I read, which comes from the Washington Post, or I think, was it Washington Post? Where is it? Of course, now I can't find it. Oh, here it is. Yeah, so this is reported by Josh Rogan in the Washington Post. And so this article talks about information going back to 2015 and going back to the last epidemic, the SARS coronavirus in 2003 that also was caused by bat population. So that's interesting. And then there's other headlines that suggest mishandling by China of this whole thing and trying to suppress it and whatnot. So yeah, lots of lessons learned that will come out of that in how we trust information and trust each other and challenge each other on the international scene to get to the bottom of things. So that was interesting. Oh, I wanted to talk about Dr. Fauci in the press conference last night. So he made a comment early in the press conference, which I thought was interesting. And the comment was paraphrasing. The first time that we went to the president with the suggestion to ban travel to China, he listened and then he executed. Or first time we went with him with mitigation, he listened and went into mitigation. So every time, Fauci was basically making a point that uh, every single time they've gone to him and proposed these things, he's listened and taken their advice. So that cuts against the narrative that he's not listening, that Trump's not listening to his experts, which the media is desperately trying to play up. And you can just look at articles and the press briefings to see that. The other thing that got a lot of attention, well, for me, so I've been big on this fog of war concept, which again came from Scott Adams. And as a military person, I am familiar with the fog of war concept. It's been drilled into my brain since my initial training back when I was 22 years old. And one thing you read as a new second lieutenant in the military, at least in the Marine Corps, is you read MCDP 1, warfighting. And I thought I'd read just this comment on fog of war because I thought this was a brilliant way of framing the scenario of January, February, leading into March with COVID-19. So here is the warfighting pub. Chapter 1, the nature of war, uncertainty. Another attribute of war is uncertainty. We might argue that uncertainty is just one of many sources of friction, but because it is such a pervasive trait of war, we will treat it singly. All actions in war take place in an atmosphere of uncertainty, or the fog of war. Uncertainty pervades battle in the form of unknowns about the enemy, about the environment, and even about the friendly situation. While we try to reduce these unknowns by gathering information, we must realize that we cannot eliminate them or even come close. The very nature of war makes certainty impossible. All actions in war will be based on incomplete, inaccurate, or even contradictory information. So I think that this is a perfect encapsulation of what happened in January and February in the US in the fog of war. And I felt this myself in some of my roles in March with information coming out very quickly, changing very quickly, this slow realization of how potentially serious this issue was, and then action starting to take place immediately after that. So, on Twitter, I'm getting into debates about the fog of war, and it didn't exist, and this is just whitewashing some incompetence in the administration. I'm not persuaded by those arguments because I think the fog of war is real. You do have contradictory information, and if you look at the World Health Organization tweets on the topic, you will see that they were giving off information that turned out to be not true. If you look at China's information in January in particular, in February, that information turned out to be untrue. And so you have contradictory information. You have experts disagreeing on the nature of this virus. And in that uncertainty, you still have to make decisions. So I would suggest that the defense that people are really hostile towards, the defense of Trump is like, look, I've made decisions based on the scenarios presented to me, the information that I had, the best information, conflicting information, trying to do risk mitigation in real time with the economy. So I think that that's what's going on. I don't think that could there have been things done earlier? Yeah, absolutely. There's no doubt that we're going to gain lots of lessons learned. And I said this yesterday, but to automatically attribute lessons learned to incompetence or ill intent, I think is proving too much. Trump total authority comment got a lot of play. My take is that he doesn't mind the coalition of states joining together to reopen the economy. I do think it presents a really interesting discussion on federalism and the role of the federal government versus states in crisis management and in their own economies. I'm in favor of more local approach to reopening because no two states are alike, and the local governments are the ones in the best position to determine for their state when would be a good time to open. So I don't think that Trump's comments on the total authority were meant to say that he can override the governor's for the purposes of reopening economies. But with a national emergency, I think that there are some pretty big powers. Now, he was fact checked false, by some of the news outlets, and I would wait for probably comments by people like Alan Dershowitz to arbitrate those fact check claims. But I do like the federal discussion. So I do like the role of the states versus the role of the federal government. And certainly that's already been in discussion with the supposed failures of the federal response to this. There's little discussion about states' failures. Were there any states' failures? If there were, there's not a lot of talk about it. What is the role of the state? Should the states have been better prepared with their state stockpiles for infectious disease? Maybe, maybe not. But certainly it's easy if you don't have a good stockpile in a certain state, and let's say you're in charge of that state, it's super easy. And I would dare say the incentive is to go, hey, the feds, they failed us. When it could be the case that just your own oversight, uh, going back for many administrations at the state level, uh, may just have been underprepared as well. So I have no problem with harmony between the local and the federal level. I just think that it's way too easy to blame and point fingers. And I think what Trump has been trying to do in the press briefings is say, wait a second, what about the states? What about their role? No one's talking about that. No one's considering that. I think that's a fascinating discussion. And I think we're going to get better as a country out of that discussion of federalism. So Wall Street Journal is reporting that banks are bracing for loan defaults. They're also reporting that there's the second round of layoffs has begun. So I think this is not good. It's not good. And so the cure being worse than the disease, I think, is very real and, dare I say, likely at this point, which is why I do think that we have to be real serious and grown up about when do we get back to work. We have to get back to work soon. I think it's going to be more towards May timeframe. I'm less inclined to think we're going to go past May. I could be wrong if new information comes up, but I don't see this going much past April and partway into May personally, based on the information I'm reading. So we need to get back to work. Otherwise, the whole capitalist enterprise is going to be called into question, and you can see those intent. You can see that movement, already in modern culture. Lastly, Joe Biden, last man standing. Even though I think that I'm a little bit concerned about his mental faculties, but Bernie endorsed him, and so did Barack Obama, which is fascinating that it took everybody else to drop out in order for Barack Obama to endorse his own vice president. Um, and like I said, I'm a little bit concerned about his mental capacity. A lot of the interviews I've seen since this COVID crisis, he mumbles, he's confused. It's concerning to me, and I know that the Democrats really want to get Trump out. I understand that, sure, but here's my suggestion: find somebody who can do it. And I would offer two people. I mean, as far as I disagree with Bernie, he's certainly not in mental decline like I think Biden is. So I think Bernie could do it, and I think that Andrew Cuomo could do it, the governor of New York State. He's shown strong leadership qualities, strong communication qualities, strong empathetic qualities, which is one of the big critiques of Trump is he's not empathetic and never admits mistakes. Cuomo doesn't have those things. The two of them have been cordial. You've seen some good things said by some of the governors for the federal response, which is nice, and that's oftentimes glossed over by the media. But he certainly would be a good option. And so my prediction is that at some point something's going to give. So when you get up to the Democratic convention and you are really faced with whether Joe Biden uh, is in a place where he can beat Donald Trump, I think there's going to have to be a real coming to Jesus moment at that point in the Democratic Party. And I think if they stick with Biden, the chances of them beating Trump go down. I think if they replace Biden or maybe augment Biden with a very, very strong VP candidate, then his chances of defeating Trump go up. And you can see already in the press some of those suggestions: Kamala Harris, Andrew Cuomo as a potential running mate. He's not going to choose Andrew Cuomo. I wish he would, but he won't. He'll probably choose Kamala Harris or somebody else, woman, maybe a minority, which is fine. I like Kamala Harris too. I disagree with her policies. I think she's, you know, competent. And so I think that, if Biden fades out into the distance and she becomes the preemptive person who's going to be in charge, that could strengthen his ticket. But bottom line, I think that when people see Biden and they see him on stage debating Trump and they see more and more critical interviews of him, it's just not going to go good. It's not going to go well. That's my prediction. So tell me what you think. Tell me what you'd like to see happen. I know a lot of people still are holding on to hope for Bernie. I don't know if that's changed after his endorsement of Biden, but I do think that there's going to have to be some sort of reckoning that's going to happen, uh, going in eyes wide open. If really the Democratic Party sticks to Joe as the lead guy, the guy who can get it done, their number one choice without qualifying it, I don't see a path where Trump would not win re-election, given the situation right now. There could be new events, there could be other information that comes out in the future that just just overwhelms the results towards the Democrats. That's certainly possible. But right now, as things stand, it's not the Democrats' best effort in my view. So that's all. But almost 50 minutes. Hopefully, you guys got some stuff out of this. Would like comments, critiques, criticisms. This is part of my 1% improvement and trying to get good at this live streaming stuff. Tell me what you think. DM me at Joel Van Brunt on Twitter or follow me on Twitter. If you're family or friend and have other contact information for me, you can reach out that way as well. Thank you guys. God bless. And I will talk to you all tomorrow.